How accessible should tests be? Individualized, standardized, or modified? And you can draw parallels between big tests, standardized tests, or tests within your own class that you create.
When it comes to exams or certificative evaluations, I think it should be standardized for people who don't have any disabilities. If the test is well made, we have to be sure that students have the skills that are expected from them. That being said, in France, we don't have any standardized tests, and students with disabilities have more time or their exam is modified. So we don't have standardized tests, and we have 3 years to make sure that our students will pass the final exam. During this process, I allow retakes on the computer for knowledge quizzes, retakes after a feedback on their tests, and I'm not there yet, but I want my students to choose on which skill they want to be tested. When they feel like they are ready, I wish they could ask me, "Sir, I want to be tested on this particular skill." That would be great. I'm not there yet. I think that individualized testing, like individualized teaching, is not a good thing for me. Different studies about it show that when it's done, teachers tend to limit their students' progress.
I find this question quite a tricky one. I believe that standardised tests have a place, and I think that if they were well designed with cognitive load and working memory limits in mind, that they would be more powerful. Sometimes I think the standardised tests that we currently have place in Australia don't actually factor these things in, and that's where the difficulties come in. There's a lot of redundancy, and then there's some issues with split attention. So I think with effective test design that standardised testing is not necessarily a bad thing. I do think it gets a bad rap in Australia in a lot of ways for probably that reason, because the design is not always necessarily in line with thinking around cognitive load. I think that obviously there should be times when tests do need to be modified in classroom situations, and cognitive load gives us a really good framework to actually do that well.
Okay, how accessible should tests be? Standardised, modified, or individualised? It's interesting because we're just preparing to write we've written a number of the assessment items for the new QCAA syllabus next year, and one of the guidelines was remove italics, remove bold, remove those little pictures you put in there, and that article gave that a little bit of context for me, which was good. In terms of modified papers, absolutely, I feel that there has to be circumstances where students with learning needs and special needs, we do need to deliver them a modified paper, because we want to see what they can do. So we obviously remove the barriers. And again, that paper gives some good foundation justification of why we should and need to be doing that.
Tests. Standardised tests have a place in the primary school, but a very small place. Modifying and individualising, absolutely. So as well as for our learning support students, majority of our assessments we modify and individualise as they are needed. Our students are allowed to retake, have assistance with tests and assessments, and it really is completed as a formative model of assessment rather than summative. So we're doing less and less summative in the classroom. It helps us to be primary school teachers as we take on this model, and we can rely less and less on tests, I guess, because we're with the children so much across a long period of time. It's a privilege that I know not all educators get.
I agree with the general consensus of those who have already responded in that assessment needs to be accessible to the widest possible audience. With standardised testing, I think you need to be very cognizant of the volume and in particular the purpose behind such assessments. I don't think we've nailed it in Australia at the moment. And I know I've been reading about certain school districts in the US who have had very undesirable results, particularly during the No Child Left Behind sort of era. I think you're going to have problems, in my opinion, with any large-scale accountability systems. So I think that modified and individualised assessments should be encouraged when necessary.
Okay, well, basically, as the people who've gone before me have said, standardised tests are kind of the thing in Australia. I'd love to, teach in France, where it claims they don't have any standardised tests, which sounds pretty amazing. That would be great. But basically, in Australia, we've committed to this sort of line that standardised tests are increasing with the new literacy and numeracy minimum standard GAT at 11 and 12 coming in 2021. That'll be sort of NAPLAN and then that GAT and then the GAT that's the VCE assessment. They're sort of increasing. And I think the current approach is if you are sitting a standardized test, then they will modify the conditions if you have a disability or specific needs. But I don't actually think that that's enough, considering the amount of time and money that the government and other people put into these tests. They should be able to be modified for different levels of processing power.
So obviously it's really important that all of our assessment is accessible. We won't even discuss NAPLAN, but in terms of making sure that the students understand the language being used, we in Queensland are only now moving to external assessment, and that's the real push, is make sure they understand what the language and the verbs and all those kinds of things, what they mean, so they can properly answer the question. Because really, I guess the idea is to make sure we're testing the skills that we want to test, not trying to overload them in something completely different. With juniors, I've worked a lot in learning support this year with working to individualise assessment for my students who are on modified programs, and allowing me to read the questions out and to provide those special provisions to them so they understand. So, pushing in the formulas to decrease that cognitive load so they don't have to go looking for it elsewhere. Really good diagrams, really, decrease the wordiness of the questions, all those kinds of things. I've worked really hard on that this year.
I think the article provides two really interesting ideas. The first one is that for test results to be valid, a student needs to have had access to the learning material and the learning outcomes before the test. So if how I'm presenting the information isn't allowing students to access the learning outcomes, then I need to change. Otherwise, there's no point doing the test, or the test isn't going to be effective. Two, I think the idea of a dual source diagram is interesting. I created Year 7 exam, and I had a diagram and I had a question underneath, and they weren't clearly linked. And so as a result, 3 or 4 students didn't answer the question correctly or didn't attempt it. Now, if I just modified the exam then and showed a clearer link, then those 3 or 4 students would have been able to access that question. Yeah.
Okay. I have, in terms of accessibility, like an example I've tried to do is providing exemplars or notes and a go-to kind of checklist, especially for assignments for students. But when I write them, I know I'm targeting the lower end students, but knowing that it's like almost universal design, so for learning. So even though it's got a low entry point, everyone can actually, it caters for all needs. So I think that is kind of one of the ways of doing that. I was involved with online NAPLAN, and there's allocations for the rest pauses for students with disabilities involved in that. Now, it does require an admin process, so I think that in itself contradicts the accessibility, but it can be granted to students. So that is a way of promoting that in testing, in standardized testing.
Shortimar mentioned universal design, which is really interesting, and there's a lot of parallels with cognitive load theory. And Nate mentioned the integrating of the different forms of information in a diagram on a Year 7 exam, and I recognise that as well. So in terms of accessibility of tests, I think we need to try and lessen the intrinsic load, so the amount of cognitive processing required to comprehend material. In history, I do that by providing lots of vocab and synonyms for complicated words in, say, sources from the 1700s or the early 20th century, so that kids are not hindered by misunderstanding words, and so that they have lots of time to really show what they learn and what they know.
So, how accessible should tests should be? Look, I think tests should allow every student to be able to demonstrate what they understand. I would love to see grades be removed, and well, that's a video for another day. But to have tests scaffolded in a way that basically allows students to demonstrate what they understand of that concept. So, you know, from low order thinking right through to higher order thinking, and allowing students to show, whether it be the teacher, whether it be a VCAR examiner, but be able to demonstrate what they understand with respect to the concept. So I think tests need to be accessible and allow students to demonstrate their understanding, and for us to be able to place them along that continuum of where they're at and what expectations they're meeting.
I think for the vast majority of students, having the one test is fine, providing that it was created with things like UDL in mind in the first place, so that it is accessible to that sort of bottom end. Obviously, this breaks down for students with specific disabilities that need scaffolding or help with that. But for the vast majority of students, I think that the one test is fine. Just to clarify, what I'm talking about is the one test in a class or in a school. Once you start generalising to the one test for a whole state, that probably becomes another question then as well.
My experience in the primary sector has been we've tended not to use tests to assess students, although in more recent years there has been movement towards use of, say, ACEs, PAT tests. The thing about that assessment is that you can assign the tests according to where students are at, so you can modify the implementation of those tests according to the needs of the students. NAPLAN, well, you can adjust or modify those, but you actually have to put in an application for. And generally, I found my experience has been that we've tended to use diagnostic assessment, and in that trying to ascertain where students are at.
In terms of the accessibility of tests, whether they're really in terms of standardised or exam, is that they really should be aimed at a student's point of need. And ideally, that comes from something that's adaptable. The reality is most tests aren't going to be adaptable. And I think that's where I think we need to aim for. But in terms of bring back to cognitive load, it's also developing the test. So we don't have those points in there as questions. The questions are written, so you try to decipher the language just to work out what's been asked, when what you're asking for is a particular response, but you've got to decipher almost like an essay to get to that point. I think that's where it's not such a good idea.
I think standardised testing does need to be accessible to all students, and using some of the recommendations of text and video and different things helps students to be able to reduce that cognitive loading if it's visually represented to them. One thing that I didn't really think that this article said was to reduce the cognitive load for students in the ways that they will show their knowledge. If I think of, my students with dyslexia, they are able to articulate so much to me. However, if I got them to write about it, I'd see a really limited example of what they actually know. So I think also to help reduce the cognitive load, we need to think of showing their knowledge in different ways, and this isn't shown in standardised tests currently.